Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your lunch and you're ready to engage in the title is Advances and Techniques in the Use of Inert Antipersonnel Mines for Training. I want to just go through who's with us today. I have Edison Pineda, humanitarian mine action expert from the Swiss EOD Center of the Federal Department of Defense, Civil Protection and Sport, DDPS, of the Swiss Armed Forces. I have online is Colin King, Chief Intelligence Officer of Fenix Insight. And here to my far right, I have Greg Crothers, Director of Programs of Mines Advisory Group. So I think this is a session that we were very much anticipating and excited about, to hear about advancements in these use of anti-personnel mines for training. So I'll start by giving the floor to Edison to take it away with the presentation. So thank you so much. And Edison, if you can just give a bit of your background before you start, that'd be great.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you for having me over. Good afternoon, everybody, Your Excellencies, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen. To my person, I work for the Swiss EOD Center. I am a humanitarian mine action expert. I'm one of three in the center. We focus on training our guys on technical and non-technical aspects of mine action so that they can be sent out, as we're going to see in my presentation, and provide technical support to partners internationally. I originally come from the private sector. I originally was doing audit and consulting. I have a degree in international business administration, majoring in finance, but more than 10 years ago, I decided to have a career shift. And since then, I've been working for the Swiss EOD Center on the different roles, different projects, etc. As mentioned previously, as it is known, Switzerland does not have any anti-personnel mines as per the definition of the Mine Ban Treaty, and we use alternatives quite often for our training. I want to talk to you a bit, very briefly, about the path that Switzerland took, specifically the Swiss Armed Forces, towards the destruction of anti-personnel mines. If you could go to the next slide. I want to talk a bit about who the Swiss EOD Center is, very briefly, why we are training our people on humanitarian mine action and manual demining. And I'm going to show you a bit the types of aids that we use, and maybe give you a bit of information about why we like them, why we don't like them much about them, etc. And then we're going to talk about other considerations that are important from my point of view. If you could go to the next slide, please. As you all may know, Switzerland has a long-standing humanitarian tradition, which is deeply rooted in all institutions. And because of this, the topic or the subject of the impact of landmines was quite present and discussed during the years before the Mine Ban Treaty was signed. And in fact, we have that in 1990, the head of the Swiss Armed Forces, the chief and commander back then, gave the order to stop using anti-personnel landmines. At that point in time, the Swiss Armed Forces decided to try to collect all already issued anti-personnel mines and stopped issuing them to the troops. This took a period of about 5 years, and in 1995, finally, the Swiss Armed Forces was able to announce that there were no longer any anti-personnel mines in use, and they were also not being issued at all anymore. This was quite helpful because in 1997, Switzerland signed the Mine Ban Treaty. And funny as it is, very shortly after the signing, the Swiss Armed Forces were able to announce that the last anti-personnel mine, Type 59, that we had been disposed on a Tuesday. So as you can see, very ceremonial about it as well. Just goes to reflect how this topic is important for the Swiss Armed Forces and, well, the Swiss government overall. A year after 1998, Switzerland was also one of the first countries that was able to ratify the treaty. In 1999, then it was confirmed that all anti-personnel mines, as per the mine treaty definition, had been successfully disposed. In general, although no exact numbers are available, one talks about hundreds of tons of anti-personnel mines were industrially disposed. Around the same time frame, around 97, 96, the first EOD unit was created as part of the Fortress Guard Corps. It's a unit that is no longer existing. And this EOD unit, as Switzerland signed the Mine by Treaty, also started supporting, sending technical personnel, technical ammunition experts, to mine disposal or mine action related projects. Our first mission was in 1997, actually, to Bosnia. And we have been sending people abroad to support humanitarian mine action partners since. In 2004, there was a bit of restructuring, and this EOD unit became what is now known as a Swiss EOD Center. Next slide, please. Next. Just in general, the type of work that we do, the areas of engagement locally, we are in charge for the explosive ordnance disposal when it comes to military ammunition. We have a UXO office, and we have about 1,000 UXO calls a year. So we're quite busy. We are also in charge of range and area clearance where there is contamination that originated, for example, from shooting range practices or more older contamination originating from the World War II era, when the Swiss Armed Forces were practicing quite widely in the mountains. Stuff still comes up, and so this requires also clearing and renaturation so that we can hand over some of this land, hand it back. We also make sure that our know-how, our capability is maintained and further develops with the requirements of the times and of the explosive ordnance threats as they develop worldwide. The last but not least, we also involve and support peace support projects in multiple, let's say, modalities, uniformed as a part of a peace support operation, or as physical security stockpile management experts, but we also provide technical staff for humanitarian mine action projects. If you could go to the next slide. We provide technical assistance. We provide access to our facilities for training if that is required and we have capacity. We can provide technical personnel for training staff for courses and other support as a case-by-case basis. If you could go to the next one, please. Throughout the long time that we've been involved supporting projects, the roles that we've fulfilled the most, or the capacity that we've undertaken the most, has been technical advisory. We've had operations officers, quality assurance officers quite a bit. We've provided technical field managers and the mining site supervisors. If you could go to the next slide and then the next. Our training, our foundation training has a lot of modules, including general EOD modules, but also has a 6-week-long module that is called Humanitarian Mine Action. Next slide, please. In that area, we try to teach our guys the more technical aspects of clearing mines, which includes the identification of the ordnance, the technical aspects, how a mine works, what are the hazards that arise from mines. We teach them and train them very, very intensively on the demining drill and procedures. We teach them about render-safe principles and also mine disposal processes and procedures. For this reason, we are required, if you could go to the next slide, please. And because we don't have anti-personnel mines, we definitely make use of whatever means that we can as an aid. And some of this is done through 3D printed mines, and some through other types of training aids that we're going to look at a bit into detail. Next slide, please. For the identification part, we use 3D printed mines, but we also use a lot of 3D, let's say, FFE ordnance models. We have a very large collection of FFE ordnance in Interlaken, close to 7,000 ammunition items, and we use this to train our guys into identifying different devices and under different points of view, covering, etc. Different types, different versions. Based on our experience, the use of 3D printed models for identification has definitely some advantages. Some of the advantages are they're very cost effective. Some of the FFE models, if you could go to the next slide, some of the FFE models, they can go for $3,000, $4,000, $6,000. So they're very pricey, and if they break, they're not easy to replace. So the introduction of 3D printed models has made it possible to bring this and to be less afraid they're going to be damaged during courses, etc. They're easily replaceable, and you can produce them in the condition that you want as a UXO or as an abandoned explosive ordnance. And if for difficult to find FFE items, you can also print your own if that is a requirement, and they're naturally safe to use. One of the less positive aspects is that if you produce this in-house, the drawing of the models is relatively time-consuming. You require a lot of technical information or ideally a FFE model of the mine to be able to do it as precise as possible. And obviously the parts, components, textures, materials, the markings, the colors, and the weight, they don't really match the real object. So you are giving your trainees an impression that is somewhat far from the reality. This is a limitation of this type of training aid. And also some components some mines have very complicated components, or some components are complicated to reproduce with a 3D printer. And you have to resource to other means. If you could go to the next slide. We also use some 3D printed materials to teach our staff how the inner workings of ammunition, how the inner mechanism of ammunition work, but mostly we use FFE items and cut up cross-sectioned items for that. These are quite helpful. However, as mentioned by the gentleman from Thailand, we also use the AOTM tools. I think it's a great aspect to learn, to teach the technicians how the different parts of a fuse, the different common types of fuses work. And this is definitely a good option didactically. If you could go to the next slide, please. And then the next. So for this, I think there's some limitations. Again, there's also always a limitation of how complex what complex mechanisms you can make with a 3D printer. Also the size and the materials. So that can be a bit challenging. And they can be costly to produce, etc. Let's go to the next slide. The one thing that we use 3D mines for very happily is for our mining procedures practice. We train our guys to be able to work as a deminer on the field, and to do the detector drill as it is required, to pinpoint the signals, to mark them, and then to excavate on the signal. And for this, we basically prepare 3D printed mines where we put a specific amount of metal inside the body in the location so that it matches as good as possible an original ammunition FFE item. So the item that we produce, 3D, and the FFE item will give the same signal. And this allows us to then produce a lot of these items and use them for detector drill testing, for excavation practice. Next slide, please. What we really like about this, one before that, please. Can you do, okay, there we go. This is an example of excavation, exactly. We can use, for example, we teach how to check for booby traps underneath. This is quite well suited for that. Okay, I'm ready for the next one. We also use, during our demining drills, specific ammunitions like these. These are prepared so that they can be triggered. What happens if they are triggered, for example, on the left, if you press too hard on the top, you will have a bang, just an audible sound. And same as the other ones. If you do the tripwire feeler drill too hard, you might trigger it. And this is an indicator for the guys, helps them realize when they're working with excessive force, for example, when they're not being too careful, or careful enough, let's say, in their practice. Next slide, please. We also use these mines to teach render-safe procedures. We teach render-safe procedure principles, and we teach render-safe procedures on commonly found mines, both at a workshop style, and if you click on the next slide, also within a scenario where we have a practice minefield, and we make our guys face different circumstances, different scenarios, different ammunition threats, and the threat evolves as they go on and continue clearing. Okay, next slide, please. For disposal procedure practice, we don't use them a lot. One of the reasons is because if they're made of plastic and materials that we don't want to really spread if not necessary around. But we have done a bit of that. We have demolished some mines. There, I must add, there are some clear benefits, but also some clear disadvantages, in my opinion. If you go to the next slide. These are definitely, using 3D printed models is definitely more cost effective than actually using live ammunition. I mean, the price of ammunition is very expensive. It provides also a very good platform to practice demolition procedures of different types. It also reduces the demolition effect, so the blast effect, the fragmentation effect are reduced, so the safety in the training, as was mentioned before by Colombia, is also reduced, which is a positive. And it's possible to produce large amount of these ammunitions at low cost, so you can have a lot of spares and training materials. The biggest disadvantage is that our guys don't really get exposed to the learning effect of having the real ammunition with a real charge and seeing what that actually does on the final result, how it looks like, what impact it has on the surrounding, etc. This is a bit lost with these aids. If we can go to the next slide. Normally, when you dispose FFE, or let's say 3D printed mines, you cannot know whether your disposal procedure would have ended in a high order or a low order. A high order is when there is a detonation, the ammunition functions as designed, and a low order is when the explosive inside burns or deflagrates without the detonation effect, so less shattering, less effect, less fragmentation. And also, the blast pressure is not there in the same way. There's no blast, so there's no blast pressure. So you will also notice difference in crater building. It's not going to be representative. And also other effects like metal contamination, whether a dangerous component will not be completely demolished and will fly off and remain as an additional hazard. You cannot assess this with this methodology. So there are some limitations. Next slide, please. So for that reason, we do understand that there are some opinions out there that using live mines can be relevant for specific procedures, and specifically we want to highlight three. Whenever we want to come up with a disposal procedure. If we want to do a low order disposal on a specific item, the first thing that we do is we try it on the live item. We don't have mines, so we don't do that with mines, but we do this with EOD related spot tasks, for example, for ammunition. That way we know that the method that we're using is going to cause, with highly likelihood, the effect that we want without having side effects that we don't want. So for the development of efficient disposal methodologies, I do think having the real thing is helpful. For establishing disposal methods for newly adopted, for example, like charges, types of charges, termite charges, it's always helpful to test it on an item that is actually representative of the reality. And also for R&D testing of new technologies, for example, I believe there's some new technologies using laser that aims to deflagrate explosives in some ammunitions. And for this, it would be ideal to see how effective this actually is into causing a low order effect versus a high order effect. If you could go to the next slide. These show different results. The result on the left is a high order result of the demolition. And if you see the photo on the right, that would be a low order result. You have less fragmentation formed. Some of the fragments and leftovers of the ammunition can be easily picked up and removed. So if you have a circumstance where you cannot afford to contaminate a minefield with metal because it reduces your operational efficiency and the amount of work and time you have to invest, a low order disposal of an ammunition item that cannot be moved safely is the way to go to keep that operational efficiency. Next slide, please. These are some examples of what we do. We actually do use as much as we can live ammunition for EOD training and disposal procedures. This is an example of us trying to figure out whether we can cause a low order on a high explosive anti-tank warhead with a detonating cord. And as we can see, it was successful. The next one. This with a 10.5 projectile, same thing, low order. And separation from the fuse and the main charge. This was also some tests that we did, and we know with a linear charge, with that amount of explosives and a particular distance on that ammunition, this procedure works quite well. Next one. Just to finalize, in terms of let's say retaining mines, I think that regardless of whether the opinion is that they can be used for training and R&D purposes or not, I think it's really important to consider that ammunition has a very limited, let's say a limited lifespan. The shelf life of ammunition, once it runs out, things start getting a bit more risky. You start having storage risks, etc. So it's something to consider. Ammunition is very often seen as an asset, but at one point, ammunition can also become a liability. And if we think about it, I mean, it's been almost 30 years since the signing of the Mine Ban Treaty. So it's a lot of time has passed where mines have been kept, maintained, stored, and depending on how these mines are stored, and the conditions, exposed to humidity, the high temperature changes, etc., mixed with items that they're not compatible with, this can increase the risk of an unexpected explosion at an ammunition site, for example. So this is something that needs to be taken into consideration. We need to offset we need to balance the benefit that we have from storing mines for R&D and research purposes versus the risk of actually storing them and the cost. And this is not something that has a universal answer. This is something that each country needs to analyze for themselves. What we do often in the Swiss Armed Forces, this is some suggestion that I have that can be done, is I do think that if a country decides to retain ammunition for training or research and development purposes, I do think there's a limited time where that can happen, and that is the shelf life of the ammunition. If you have a surveillance program, this shelf life can be expanded. But nonetheless, this decision should require analysis, to really figure out what are our needs, how are we going to use this ammunition, are we going to use it for testing, how much testing are we going to use it for, how much trainings do we want to cover, over what time span, and should generate a program where we can say, okay, our goal is to get rid of the ammunition by the end of its shelf life, and we're going to dispose it gradually according to a specific plan, for example. And if there's no opportunity to use this for training, we will dispose it anyway, so that we meet the disposal schedule and we can maintain safety. So this is my presentation. I thank you very much for your time and interest, and I will be answering your questions during the questions and answers part.
Thank you very much, Edson. That's great. Thank you for highlighting the pros and cons so clearly, and the shelf life issue is very important. I think Tuesday will forever be my Swiss mine-free day. Thank you so much for that. Now we have Colin King online, and I'd ask perhaps we reserve the questions till we hear all presentations, and then we can come back to it.
Sure. Thanks for having me, and I'm very sorry I can't be there in person. I have a very important job looking after 2 cats and a house at the moment. Yeah, my name's Colin King. I've been involved in EOD and mine action since 1986, so nearly 40 years, which is why I look so tired. My job at the moment, I'm ex-army and military intelligence. And my job at the moment really is mainly the disassembly and analysis of ammunition, including a lot of landmines. Been doing that for a very long time, still very active in that. So for instance, several trips to Ukraine in the last 2 years, bringing back and disassembling the latest mines from there, for example. So what has happened inevitably is, firstly, we've formed a very large collection, a hardware collection, which I will talk about a little bit later. And then when you have real mines and you know about real mines, people approach you to ask for training aids and all the same applications that Edison has just been talking about. Sadly, I couldn't see Edison's slides. In fact, I'm not sure he's even a real person because I could only hear a voice. But I think many of the points I have to make will reinforce those that he already made. So if I can try and share my screen now, because you've seen enough of me. And hopefully, yeah. So can you see my screen there? Is that all right?
Yeah, we can see it. Thank you.
That's great. Okay, so that was the introduction bit. So the applications have already been mentioned. There's mine risk education, of course. Edison talked a lot about detection and the disposal aspects of uncovering and then a final demolition or whatever you choose to do to get rid of it. There are many other applications that we need or needs that we have. One that we've been asked about a fair bit is the use of rapid clearance expedients and knowing whether those have worked. Has a flail, has a grinder actually destroyed a mine, for which you need a large number of targets and you need to register what has happened. And then there's all sorts of research and development, of course, in detection, demolition techniques, and for those, you want something that's very good. So let me just talk about the sort of characteristics that you do want. On screen, that hopefully you can see there are some of the surrogates that I make. And the sort of thing that we need is a realistic appearance. So outlined in red are the must-have for most applications. It's really important to whether it's for mine risk education, for troops in the field, for deminers, that what they see is representative of what they are going to see. There are times for detection training when, as Edison mentioned, you want the correct metal content. And then it should be affordable. It should be strong. And then there are various nice to have additions, such as good if you can move it by air, good if you can move it around easily within a country program, which means it's good if it's portable and light. But also you heard a reference to filling, and it's good if you can also add weight to it and possibly add an explosive substitute or even add real explosive into the shell. So these are some of the things that may be wanted, and different requirements may put emphasis on different parts of this. But the realistic appearance is one of the key ones that comes up again and again. So if we think about production options, already mentioned was the use of real mines. And this is something that I do in many countries where there are landmine stocks. You effectively satisfy two requirements in one. You destroy a mine and you create a training aid. There are issues over whether what you produce is then compliant, whether it's declarable, registered, and so forth. So, for example, the inert mines that we keep in our collection are licensed items in the UK. They have to be reported on, they have to be secured, and they require a license. I'm not going to talk any more about this, except that I agree with Edison. It is a good option where it exists to use the real thing, and then you know that it's correct. 3D printing has already been mentioned. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about molding. So on 3D printing, advantages already been outlined here. You can create the file yourself, or you can be sent it. So it can be a digital file. You can pick up a 3D printer pretty much anywhere for almost any price you care to pay. And you can print relatively complex and small parts pretty easily. Disadvantages, unless you get your colors specially made, then color match is often a problem. The biggest one for me is surface texture. Even with superfine 3D printing, you do not get the correct surface texture. And both of those things and other items mean that 3D printed mines, to my mind, are not very realistic. I've seen very few that were. Molding, of course, many of the plastic mines were made by injection molding, and that is fine if you're mass producing them. But what we tend to get asked for is 3, 5, maybe 10. The largest order I've ever had was for 14 of various types of mine. And that is just no good if you're trying to do injection molding. The reason for that is that injection molding typically needs a metallic mold, even for low volume prototyping, and these run to thousands of dollars. So it's a long time before you make your money back. Most programs, as I say, only want a very few. It's just not worth it unless you can consolidate orders from different places. The problem is that different programs, different countries want different types of mine. So there are a few common types, the Russian PMN, the Chinese Type 72, that lots of people want, and perhaps those justify bulk production. But generally speaking, people want small quantities, and injection molding is just not a good option then. What we tend to use more is a hand molding process, and there's an example there. You can get the color match pretty exact with that. The mold is a rubber room temperature vulcanizing rubber mold, and it picks up every detail, every scratch, every dent, and so they look completely correct. And in fact, the more they wear, the more realistic they look. Unlike ones where they've been painted, for example, and the color underneath comes through. Here, the color goes all the way through. These are made in a resin. They're not expensive to produce. Disadvantages are really, you need the original to work from. You can't do this easily from a file. A 3D printer is a standalone item, very little else. whereas with this, you need lots of bits and pieces, and it's relatively skilled work. You need to practice it, but the results are extremely good. The other thing that's important for me is aging. It's one of the things that we study. We go all over the world looking at ammunition. Mentioned a lot of this stuff was laid 30, 40, 50 years ago, and therefore it is aging. So on the right, for example, the right-hand image there, that is a Russian POM-3 mine that I brought back from, well, it's not an actual one. I brought one back from Ukraine over a year ago, and these are the surrogates we make. We can incorporate iron powder in the molds, and then you rust it exactly, or you can advance the rusting very quickly, but you can end up with degraded items that are extremely realistic, and that's so important. So you can see the colors, the texture, and the surface effects all coming into play there. Talking of realistic training, already we've had some mention of active surrogates. Again, we've made some of those. You can make them electrical to make a noise when they're stepped on or activated, or you can incorporate a small device. So this one that you see on the bottom uses a shotgun primer. That's incredibly cheap. They make a loud bang, but they've got relatively little power. And there you can have a stake mine. Again, this is a molded mine that gives a realistic effect. So these are options. I also mentioned earlier active measures for clearing mines, clearance expedients. And again, you can have something reactive that either makes a bang, smoke, or just has a mechanism inside that registers an effective hit. That's easy to do. Here's a bit of our hardware library. And sorry, I'm just going to turn that phone off. This hardware library incorporates pretty much all of the mines that have been used in recent years, including the newest ones used by Russia and Ukraine. We refer to this constantly for research purposes, for all kinds of training, for characterization. And the other thing that we can do with those is digitize those mines. So here's a Russian PTM-4 mine, one of the newest Russian mines in use in Ukraine. We get one example, we can create a digital file from that, and that can then be rendered and recreated. The other thing is, of course, that digital file can be sent to a 3D printer anywhere in the world. This also brings in another application, which is starting to think about virtual reality and augmented reality. And this is where, again, having synthetic models comes in handy. So here is one of another Russian mine from Ukraine, PTM-1. There's the wireframe, and you can see now that it's being rendered. And that allows us to see it from all angles, but also to put it virtually into other virtual landscapes. We can train people on it, but we can also train our own recognition systems on it in different lighting conditions, contrast, and we can then obscure it with vegetation or rocks so that it becomes incredibly realistic. And you can use that imagery to train the image recognition systems that we are currently building. So just to summarize what I've gone over, as I say, reinforcing many of the very good points that Edison made in his presentation, I think realism is extremely important. If it's mine risk education, deminer training, EOD training, you need to show someone what they're actually going to see. And if they're not going to see a green, shiny mine, then they shouldn't be shown it and training with it. Inert mines are probably the best way to go if possible, but clearly there are limitations there. I don't like 3D printing. We've used it, we've tried it, we keep trying it, we keep trying to improve it. and it never produces good enough results for what we want. Injection molding is not really an option unless we can get some global orders that run into the thousands that we can distribute all over the place. The only time I've used injection molding is where we've got access to the maker's original molds, which happened in Bosnia, for example, and we're able to get companies to then injection mold using those. But the best results that we get are from hand molding. Anyway, I will also save my questions for later. I hope you're able to see that. Otherwise, I've been talking for a long time about something not very interesting. And take questions at the end. Thank you.
Greg, if you can introduce yourself for a second.
I will.
Thank you.
Thanks, and I'll try and give us a bit of time, JC, so that we have some time for questions. So I know this meant to wrap up at 3. My name's Greg Crowther. I'm the Director of Programs for MAG. I think most of you probably know who MAG is. We're, one of the world's sort of largest, oldest humanitarian mine action NGOs. We also do work in ammunition management, weapons management. My Excellency, the colleague from Benin mentioned this morning, we've been assisting in the destruction of stockpiles and obsolete ammunition there. But I just want to talk today a little bit really about our, from a humanitarian mine action operator, the perspective on the way we use mines in our training. Very similar points, to be honest, that have come through from Colin and Edison, and I feel a little bit embarrassed coming after them because they very much are technical experts. And as I say, I'm the Director of Programs. I have a large team of technical experts, and I've drawn on them today. So hopefully they have given me good information that matches what's come through from Colin and Edison. Otherwise, I'll be on the phone. So you'll be pleased to know you can count them down. There's only 7 slides, so we won't be here for too long. And this is slide 1. So next slide. So yeah, I just want to quickly go over really from as I say, not going into a lot of the details about Article 3, not going into details about the replicas, but really just how we as an operator use them, how we as an organization that trains a lot of people, thousands and thousands of people every year in very different environments, in very different contexts, with very different types of threat, how we manage that, some of the challenges we face with different types of alternatives to FFE'd mines, which we'll go into a little bit. So a little bit about our policies and processes, not a lot, because policy and process is never going to be super exciting. Common practices in MAG, that just means we minimize the number of mines that we use, and just looking a little bit to future and technologies and our experience of them, but very much as an end user and not with the same degree of expertise as Colin has kind of gone into, or that Edison showed about how their school uses them. Thank you. Next slide. So, probably an obvious statement, but we don't keep live mines, obviously. We are there to destroy them. We have mines that have their, that don't have their explosive content, that are fused, that can be armed, that are ready to function. We don't hold those. They would be destroyed as part of our operations or handed over to a national authority to destroy. We do hold a limited number, we can define limited later, but of disarmed, free from explosive mines, with the fuse removed, with the explosive removed. These have been collected during demining activities. They're collected from ammunition storage areas. They may have been found abandoned. Obviously, in a lot of the countries, we've been working for many, many years, so we've been able to build up very large stocks and supplies of this type of item. And we use them for classroom training, we use them for practical training, detection, excavation, and so on. We use them for trials of new equipment. We use them as detector test pieces, which is very, very important. And we use them for demonstration purposes, like we have outside, when people visit the program, or when we have to do displays at embassies to raise awareness. And they're the main use of those items. Next slide, please. I did just want to touch quickly on anti-tank mines, because they are, anti-tank mines are an excellent source of a donor demolition charge, and we do use them when we find them as donor charges for bulk demolitions. We don't hold them for very long. We don't keep a massive store of them, but they are something that is very, very useful for limiting the use of other explosives when you're trying to destroy large numbers of items that you may have collected during EOD tasks, for example. That's not the case for anti-personnel mines, so we don't need them for that. Most of the mines that we find are destroyed in place. That's for a few different reasons, really. It's practical, it's safer, it requires less training than having to move them. It's something that we can generally do reasonably efficiently. And whether it's MAG destroying them or whether it's a national authority, whether it's, for example, the Sri Lankan military in Sri Lanka who come and destroy them, as long as they're destroyed, it's sort of, the process is easier for us to manage. It's the end result of the detection and excavation process. Detection, excavation, destruction, and it just keeps things relatively simple. We have render-safe procedures for 7 anti-personnel mines. I say approximately because there was a bit of debate of whether it's 7 or 8 between the two technical guys, and I just said, I'll call it approximately. For example, the VS-50, someone mentioned that. That's an Italian mine which you find in Iraq. The Valmara 69, another Italian mine. So we do have render-safe procedures for a very limited number of items that can be rendered safe reasonably easily with training. But that's not the majority of mines. The majority of mines they're no touch, or we choose not to develop. We have chosen not to develop render-safe procedures for them and just destroy them where they are. We might use render-safe, in certain circumstances when explosives are limited for efficiency. It can be quicker if it's a certain, like for the VS-50, it's quicker than actually doing the destruction. The environmental reasons is an interesting one. We find a lot of those in Iraq. In the summer, it's very hot. It's often found in woodland or grassland, scrubland, and you don't want to set off fires. And actually, it's easier to bring them to a central bulk demolition location and destroy them there. So RSP has a role, but you do then just collect them and destroy them at an alternative location. But really, the primary need for us for FFE'd mines, and I'll talk about FFE in the next slide, is for having high-fidelity substitute targets as test pieces for our detectors, for new detectors, different detectors, using detectors in different soil, using detectors in different climatic environments. That's really the primary thing we need. What was a mine and is now an FFE'd mine, that's what we need them for. Next slide. So over the years, as I say, the technical specialists, we've probably ended up FFEing, making free from explosive many thousands of mines. In most of our programs, we'll have, I think, Colin showed you, and we saw from Edison, pictures of large stocks of mine. You mentioned several thousand. I think we would probably hold globally something very similar, many, many thousands of different items. And obviously, when you go into a new environment, somewhere like Ukraine, where there is new ordnance, new types of mines, you do want to make sure that you get a good set of them for being able to do the training, for being able to test the detectors, for being able to demonstrate them to new deminers, and so on. However, FFEing is a complex process. It carries a lot of risks. It generates a lot of management processes. You need very robust standard operating procedures for making things FFE. Even for disarming them, to take them later away for bulk demolition, you need good SOPs, but FFE is even more complex. You need to be able to have processes in place for risk assessment. You need to have good tools, good facilities. You need dedicated logistics. You need a quality management process. You might need to certify it with the national authority or with another body within the government that isn't necessarily the National Mine Action Authority. It could be the Ministry of Defense. It could be somebody else. You need to be able to then, store them while you're doing that. It requires extremely high levels of training, EOD 3+, and actually there aren't any formal competencies listed in IMAS or in IATGs. There's a very interesting article last year in the JMU written by a colleague at GICHD, Rolly Evans, around how, as something that takes place quite widely in the mine action sector, it's quite an unregulated part of the sector. The process of making items free from explosive. However, it is something that we have done over the years, and it really is a critical part of using what were mines for the demining process. And as I say, we've found that, although there are alternatives, there are some limitations. We'll move on to that next. So here's a couple of that's a free from explosive VS50. Similar, that's a free from explosive Valmara. That over there is actually a manufactured, so this is talking more to Colin's idea of specially manufacturing a very limited number of items. I think it's of a P2 mine from Sri Lanka. That's a very, very difficult to find mine, very minimal metal. So that was, that's a test piece that we had made. They're extremely challenging mines. So we have used FFEs, as you can see there, and we'll use them either to teach people render safe, or we'll use them as test targets for our detectors, or if necessary, we can get them, them made. But as Colin mentioned, we aren't making hundreds of them, we're making very few, so it's hard to find a manufacturer. You really have to work closely with someone and try to get something that very much replicates what you're looking for. The detector manufacturers also do test pieces, which is very important. You can see there test pieces from different detector manufacturers, Schonstad, Schiebel, Chea, MineLab, etc. And Chea, for example, also make test pieces that replicate the specific electromagnetic signature of different types of commonly found mines. So you may be able to use those rather than a free from explosive mine if you're not able to get those. And they're generally very reliable. Next slide. Just talking a little bit, and this is maybe very much echoing some of the points made by the previous presenters. Manufacturing, 3D printing, those are two separate processes, but I've put it there as one word, but manufacturing 3D printed mines, it's relatively easy to implement. For example, we've recently just bought a 3D printer in Ukraine. We couldn't get replicas easily. We could quite quickly generate some simple classroom tools. They're okay for, we found for classroom training, just for showing people what a mine looks like, maybe even for some sort of risk awareness, risk education. They're really not so far, much use beyond that. I think if you were then to get them to a better sort of, to be able to use them in a more wide range of sort of training activities, you're going to have to go to a much more professional manufacturer, probably the type that you've been dealing with. Manufactured mines we've found, they can be very expensive, so thinking more about the ones that Colin showed, they can be very expensive. The quality can be variable. Their accuracy in terms of weight and size is not always there. That's very important. They're not robust, they don't last, and they don't always really replicate the weathered conditions very effectively. So as Colin said, you want to be training people on what they're going to find, what it looks like when they find it. To minimize the risk. So as I say, really the main constraint for us is the requirement for very high quality substitute targets, and that's really what we're mainly using free from explosive mines for. That's the primary thing that we need them for, the use and testing of new detectors. And I think next slide. Yes, thank you. So JC, hopefully we've got a little bit of time for questions. Thank you.
Please, Mario.
Muchas gracias por las exposiciones a los señores que están en la mesa. Yo tenía dos preguntas. Una para el señor de Suiza. Pero antes de ello quisiera describir el escenario que tiene el Perú, que es un escenario muy particular, porque nuestras minas están en una zona denominada Cordillera del Cóndor. Fundamentalmente se dice cordillera porque es un conjunto de montañas que están en la selva. Entonces, con montañas de casi 3.000 metros, donde llueve casi todo el año, con pendientes muy extremas. Esa es la frontera entre Perú y Ecuador. Entonces, mi pregunta va, yo le escuché decir al señor expositor de Suiza la posibilidad de hablar de tiempo de vida de las minas. Entonces, la cuestión va, esa mina se ha sembrado aproximadamente hace 30 años, y habla un poco de las condiciones climatológicas, y es posible elaborar un periodo de vida de esta mina. O sea, ¿existe algún procedimiento de laboratorio donde uno pueda someter a un análisis a esta mina que ha estado en este escenario que acabo de indicar, para poder definir que realmente su tiempo de vida ha concluido? Y la otra pregunta es para el señor expositor de MAG, donde hablaba de la firma electromagnética para la fabricación de detectores. Entonces, ¿qué procedimiento? Nosotros tenemos detectores muy antiguos y estamos en pro de adquirir detectores nuevos. Y él habla de una firma electromagnética para fabricación de estos detectores y poder alinear la firma del tipo de mina que tenemos en el escenario que acabo de mencionar y obtener un detector que esté alineado pues, a esa firma electromagnética. Gracias.
Juan Carlos? Sorry.
Okay,
Yes.
so to answer your question, there are ways, and there have been studies that precisely target these sort of questions, where certain circumstances, certain substances have been tested, for example, and subjected to accelerated aging to see how a specific component, for example, could age based on its exposure to heat, to humidity, etc. But I must say that in order to do such for a specific ammunition model, you would have to take into consideration a lot of the components. Let me just give you an example. A mine is made of energetic materials, which is like primary, secondary explosives. Sometimes you could have pyrotechnics, sometimes you could have propellants inside. And these substances, they age differently. And the effects of aging can vary and also be influenced in different ways by different external factors. Then you have also mechanical components. You have springs, you have strikers, you have detents that keep the mechanism from moving. And these are made of either plastic or metal or other materials. And these materials also age. And the aging will vary naturally on the level of exposure to water. For example, you could have springs that lose their strength, they're holding, for example, a pressure plate, as it is the case in the PMN. The PMN, for example, the Russian PMN. The bottom spring keeps the pressure plate upheld on the upward, and over time this spring can fail if it's, for example, if it's subject to a lot of water gets into the mine, and the spring is flooded, then it slowly fails, and then with weight of the different layers of dirt, soil, whatever has been piling up over the years, this could cause the pressure plate to slowly go down and be at a position where it can almost be set off by no effort at all. So there's a lot of variables to how a mine might age based on the components that it has, where it is, its environment, the climate, what other objects, other substances around it that can interact with chemical components. So it's actually very difficult to come up with a very reliable answer that would apply to everything. There would have to be detailed studies done that particularly reflect the exact situation that you're trying to portray. So what we work with normally in the sector is with concepts of aging, general concepts of aging, and we build that into a risk assessment. When we head to a site and we see there's a lot of water on the floor, there's a lot of, for example, there's a lot of temperature changes day and night. We understand conceptually how this can affect specific types of explosives, and then we build that into the analysis and expect that the life, let's say the usable life or the safety features of that device are probably not going to reflect what the manufacturer will have stated in terms of shelf life. I hope that answers your question.
Colin, I could feel you before I go to Greg. I could feel Colin through the Zoom, because I know you've been doing a lot of studies in Cambodia and Colombia and other places on aging. So I don't know if you want to chime in here, Colin, and if you can put on your camera, it'd be great to hear you.
Sure. Yeah. As I said in my presentation, we've been studying the aging of ammunition for many years, including a 3-year study for the US State Department, and then a couple of major studies that were written up with James Madison University in the journal. So I agree with everything that's been said, except that there's a degree of predictability because certain mechanisms tend to react in certain ways. There is an assumption among the mine action and the EOD community that things get more dangerous and unstable. And actually the reality from the studies is that most things become less dangerous, but they can temporarily go through a more dangerous phase. It's a little bit like a car. If you leave a car for 40 years, it probably won't work after that. If you leave it for 100 years, there's nothing dangerous. There's no electricity, there's no fuel, nothing is dangerous. It returns to nature. The dangerous time is maybe after 10 years that the engine still runs, but the brakes don't work or the steering doesn't work. So you can have a temporary situation where things get more dangerous. But that is largely predictable by the materials involved. So we can look at a type of mine, knowing its structure, and make a good, sensible prediction. But then what we do is what we call exploitation, which is looking at mines from that area. We take them to pieces. This is what I do. We do the studies. I think Hans is in the room somewhere. We've been doing this for Norwegian People's Aid for a long time. Last year, I did it for Halo Trust in Angola, and we're just talking about doing that again this year. So that is the way to do it. You can make a paper prediction, and then you must back it up with the exploitation work. Sorry, long answer to a short question.
Thank you very much, Colin. And now I'll hand it over to Greg. And if you want to chime in on the other question as well, feel free.
No, that's.
Okay.
I mean, I think that's all been. Sorry, that's all clear. There is that wide variation because very individual locations can vary quite significantly in terms of how much water there may have been, how much water ingress there might have been into the item. So it's quite difficult, even if you do the studies and you find it, unless you've got minefields in very consistent locations with consistent weather effects or water effects, there is quite a lot of variables to take into account. So, and even once you've done the risk assessment, what do you do with that risk assessment? How do you have to present that to the national authorities to allow them to maybe to do a different treatment of the fact that perhaps the mine is not functional? Like, what does it practically mean even once you get to the end of that process? It might mean that the majority are not functional. Are you going to, you have to have a high degree of confidence to recommend that you're going to adopt a higher risk operational approach. So I think there's a few steps even once you've done the study to understand what that means, and a few people to bring along is probably what I'd say. On the detector, I mean, obviously what we're talking about there is just a standard detector, not a ground penetrating radar detector, delivering a electromagnetic signal and getting back an electromagnetic field disruption, and then a sound through the detector. So and every mine gives a different magnetic response because it has more or less metal, different types of metal, and so on. That's my understanding of it. I'm not a detection expert, but that's broadly what it is. Edison, correct me if any of that's wrong. And the soil itself can make a difference if the soil is highly magnetized, laterite soil, and so on. So really you have to have test pieces that have a very similar sort of type and amount of metal that give the corresponding electromagnetic field to the actual mine that you were basing that you're looking for. And then you put it in the soil in the type of conditions in which you are searching, and you set the detector accordingly. And really, that's why I go back to the presentation. You need test pieces that as closely as possible replicate the electromagnetic signal of the original mine, and the closest possible is generally a free from explosive version of that mine. Not always, but generally. We've also been doing work. I think the colonel from Thailand mentioned HDR&D. They're trying to produce replicas that mirror the electromagnetic field. That would be great, and they've made quite a lot of progress there. So that would be extremely useful. And there is a question also about the use of ground penetrating radar detectors what they need a very similar shape. They might need a false explosive content in it to give the same signal back. So really, you're looking for something very, very as similar as possible to the original. But there are methods to do that.
Thank you very much, Greg. Can I give the floor to Mali and follow Mauritania after?
Merci bien, Juan Carlos. Je tiens sincèrement à remercier tous les trois panélistes par rapport aux différentes informations que nous avons reçues. J'ai cru entendre que la Suisse a une belle expertise en la matière, en matière de déminage et en matière d'impression 3D. L'idéal, c'est de se rapprocher des euromines, c'est se débarrasser de toutes les mines antipersonnelles existantes, évidemment. J'ai beaucoup entendu parler de l'impression 3D. Cette technologie de substitution ou cette solution de substitution, évidemment, a un coût. Et a un coût et il faut se référer à une technologie. Étant donné que les pays ne vont pas aux mêmes vitesses, les pays n'ont pas les mêmes priorités, les pays n'ont pas les mêmes contextes, évidemment. Certains pays seront enclins à garder la méthode traditionnelle, à savoir avoir le stock minimum de mines, en attendant d'avoir la technologie et les moyens nécessaires pour pouvoir quand même continuer l'instruction au sein des forces armées et de sécurité des différents pays. Donc, j'ai une question spécifique pour la Suisse. Est-ce qu'en dehors de l'Europe ou en dehors des différents pays où la Suisse a eu à intervenir, est-ce que la Suisse a un penchant ou a peut-être des possibilités d'étendre son expertise vers certains pays du Sahel ou de l'Afrique de l'Ouest en la matière? Donc, aux trois panélistes également, j'ai une question, c'est la question liée au coût de ces mines à impression 3D. Quel peut être le coût minimal, ou bien le coût minimum plutôt, ou bien quelles peuvent être les solutions à court terme en dehors de l'impression 3D pour qu'il y ait d'autres types de mines hors les mines actives. Merci.
Thank you. Yes. Well, to the question about Switzerland intervening or supporting outside of Switzerland, this is a bit of a political question. Our center is always happy to provide support, but our support is naturally dependent on approval from the political side, from the International Relations Department of the Swiss Armed Forces. But they are happy to take requests for support, and they will review the request for support. And if there's political will and there's resource availability, that there's definitely a possibility. And to the other question, I know a colleague of mine that was preparing mines for training made out of wood. Just carving them and making them out of wood chunks, and then adding metal also on the inside. So there is definitely, with a bit of creativity, one doesn't have to have the 3D printing methodology. 3D printing is just very convenient because once you have your file, you just buy your material and then you print a couple and that's it. But I've seen other methods, like for example with wood items with some metal content. For me, the cost estimation is a bit difficult. I think a 3D printing machine here in Switzerland, I can tell you, will go between $1,500 to $3,000 and perhaps more, depending on the size, the brand, and the functionality. What is also very expensive is that the software that you can use for drawing the mines. Some of these printers might come with some software, some basic software. But if you want to get really complex functionality, this software can also be quite expensive. It can cost thousands of dollars. And the materials are not that expensive. I think they're, with a roll, I'm not sure what the roll of printing yarn goes for these days, but it's definitely not more than $50. This is a very, very poor estimation because I haven't purchased one for a long time.
Thank you very much. I'll pass the floor to Colin, if you have any remarks on this.
Well, some of the mines that I showed in my presentation were actually made for Mali. They went to people like TDI who were working there. The good news is that Mali, there are not too many mines that you need there. The most common one is the Belgian PRBM3. So we've molded that. Yeah, you can either make it in country with simple, cheap materials, the molding rubber and the resin, or it can be made in the UK and shipped as we have done. So we sent about 10 of those so far. We have the molds already made. If you want the PRBM3, we can make more for you.
And Colin, about the cost of surrogates, what's the price usually for purchasing these?
Well, the price for purchasing them from us is largely to do with my time. The best thing is to set up an internal program, and then the cost of materials is really very low. So the mold for an anti-personnel mine might cost $20, and each one after that would be about the same, something like that. But they run to hundreds of dollars because it takes a lot of my time to do that. Unfortunately, we don't have people sitting around waiting to do that because the requirements are so sporadic. You know, every now and then someone will ask for 10 of something or 5 of something else, but we can't employ someone just to do that.
Thanks, Colin. Greg, anything to add on this one?
I mean, just on the cost of 3D printer, I think we bought one in Ukraine for $4,000. It costs very little to run. But as I say, it depends what you want to do with the produced, what comes out the other end, because they're okay for classroom teaching and, you know, showing people a little bit what they look like and feeling, but that's probably about it. So yeah, the not expensive for that. It depends what the purpose is really of that you're trying to get to.
Thanks, Greg. Now I'll go to Mauritania, followed by Belarus.
السلام عليكم. بعد التحية والسلام، إنه لمن دواعي الفخر والامتنان أن أدلي بدلي في هذا الموضوع الذي يكتسي أهمية بالغة في إطار التقدم نحو عالم خال من الألغام. تطالب المادة الرابعة جميع الدول بتدمير المخزون لديها، وفي الحقيقة هي مطالبة واردة ومبررة، إلا أن المادة الثالثة أتت للسماح بالدول بالاحتفاظ بعدد محدود لأغراض تدريبية تكوينية، وهي واردة ومبررة هي الأخرى. وهذه المواد المكملة بعضها البعض تدفعنا إلى التفكير مليا في هذا المضمار، وخصوصا في بعض النقاط المحورية، وهذا كله طبعا من باب موضوعي وصريح. أعلمكم أن بلدي دمر في السنة الماضية 70 لغما مضادا للأفراد، وسنواصل إن شاء الله في نسق تصاعدي حتى نصل إلى أقل عدد ممكن. في هذه السنة إن شاء الله ننوي تخلص من 200 تقريبا لنصل إلى أقل مستوى ممكن في أسرع وقت. وفي هذا الإطار أود أن أشير إلى أن المادة الثالثة هي في الحقيقة واردة ومنطقية، حيث أن البلدان تختلف في قوانينها وفي مناخها وحتى في تطورها العلمي. فالبدائل التي تم التطرق إليها اليوم قد تشكل، ورغم أنها مهمة جدا للمجتمعات وللجيوش، إلا أنها قد تشكل خطرا بالغا نظرا للعديد من المعايير. فاختلافها في الشكل واللون قد يشكل خطرا حقيقيا، رغم أنها تشبه كثيرا اللغم الحقيقي. فاللغم عندما يتعرض لوسائل التعرية لمدة عقدين من الزمن يختلف في الشكل كما أنه يختلف في اللون، أي يتغير كما هو الإنسان. لا أحد ينكر الفوائد الجمة لهذه البدائل، إلا أنه من الأهمية بمكان أن نراجعها قبل نشرها بصفة عامة ورسمية. علما أن التطهير الميكانيكي هو الآخر يتطلب الكثير من التجارب على الألقام مختلفة ومتفرقة، ويشير هنا إلى أن الاختلاف الكبير في أنواع الألقام يجعلنا نرتبك في بعض الأحيان. فهنالك الألقام الموجهة وأخرى ذات تحكم عن بعد comme la Claymore par exemple la M18، وعوائق أخرى يضيق الوقت على التطرق إليها. لكن هذه المعطيات لا تبرر أبدا الاحتفاظ بعدد هائل من الألقام. أرى بعض الأحيان عدد يتجاوز المنطق، إلا أنني أطالب الجميع بتدارس وتأمل في هذا الموضوع قبل أن يبسط التفكير فيه ويتم الاسترسال فيه. حبذا لا راجعنا الموضوع وفكرنا فيه جليا بصفة شفافة موضوعية لا تحيز فيها لطرف عن آخر. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.
Thank you very much, Mauritania. And just to mention, just what you say, there's intricate connection between stockpile destruction and Article 3. I think we have to look at this connection between Article 7 as well, the transparency reporting, because it's very important to know why states are keeping the mines, and also how they determined that what the mines that they're retaining are the minimum absolutely necessary for training purposes. So this transparency is increasingly important for the convention to understand the retention of mines by states. So now I want to pass it to Belarus.
Thank you very much. Very interesting 3 presentations, and very, I would say, raising a lot of things to thought and to ask. I think that from the very beginning we understood that the best number of mines for keeping is 0, but some we can retain for training. But now, after this very, I would say, detailed and full of contents presentations, it's understandable that probably it's not necessary to destroy all mines just by exploding. Maybe it's necessary to keep some of them for training purposes, but disarm them. And easiest way to explode everything and then to make less worthy 3D copies, but maybe it's reasonable to keep something and to disarm them professionally. But the question is, whether it's costly effective. Is there any economic demand for that? And I'm really a very new person here, but it's very interesting for me to listen, to hear your comments.
Thank you very much for the question. And along with that, I'm also curious to know what the dangers of FFE is. That's free from explosive, how difficult it is to do, and why it's a dangerous procedure. Maybe that could be part of the answer. I don't know if, Greg, you want to give it a shot first?
Maybe not. I mean, I'm sure Edison and Colin can talk about it, both having, well, Colin certainly having done it, about the dangers of it. But in terms of how many are necessary, I mean, I think, you know, as I said, we found in Iraq that we've been working there since 1992. We have a large training school. We had several hundred sort of these items to the point where, and it's important to distinguish here between disarming and certifying as FFE, because disarming is making it safe to move and not armed, and then certifying it as FFE is taking out and removing the primary and secondary explosives. So disarming is one aspect, and then certifying FFE is a second aspect. But we've actually been destroying some of the old FFE models because we just have too many. So you don't need that many. You know, it depends how many people you're training, but you're not really going to be training so many people. You can have 20 people on a training course, even if they have one model each. You need 20, you know, and maybe if you do 2 training courses, you need 40 or 50. So you're talking quite small numbers of any specific type of mine. You might need a large number if there's a large variety of ordnance. So somewhere like Angola, probably in Ukraine, where there's going to be a large variety of ordnance, a large variety of mines, you'd have a large number of free from explosive items, but you don't need hundreds of a single item. So if there's thousands in the stockpile, and you know, I would certainly make some free from explosive and keep them. I think that would be a good idea. But you know, I wouldn't keep 17,000 free from explosive versions of a single mine. You know, that wouldn't make a lot of sense. In terms of the complexity, I mean, I've been told and I've seen it, but maybe Edison or Colin can talk more easily to that.
Do you want to go ahead, Edson?
Yeah, I just also wanted to make a small clarification. When we train our technical staff on render safe procedures, we do so not with the intention of separating the fuse and the main charge and then keeping them, but we do that only because every action on an ammunition that has been deployed or as a UXO, for example, or a mine that's been deployed, has risk. Because when you try to open something or remove parts, you don't know what the condition is inside, you don't know whether some parts are decayed. And again, this varies depending on the ammunition model that you talk about, quite widely, broadly, excuse me. But the reason why we do this is if we have a circumstance, for instance, where we have a mine that we say, okay, as previously you mentioned, a specific number of mines are relatively easy to render safe. And if you assess the site and you know the contamination hasn't, you know, the mine has not been there for too long, the component's probably not going to be as decayed. If the conditions are optimal for the components to remain in good shape, then your risk goes down. And then what we do is, if you have an ammunition, for example, let me just give you an example of a situation. We have a mine that has a specific amount of metal content, and we're using detectors to find these mines and clear them. If I were to blow a mine in situ, for example, I have the risk of spreading metal fragmentation throughout a broad area around where the mine has been demolished. And this metal contamination will cause me a lot of issues when I then go back with my detector and try to continue working. Not only when I continue working, but the areas that I've already cleared before will have been recontaminated with metal, which will give me a quality assurance problem when I have to hand over the land as free from mine and metal contamination to a specific depth. So this makes the process highly inefficient. This drives the cost up and the operation and the time for operations for the project greatly. And obviously, this is, as international donors, this is very important that our organizations, my national organizations, work as efficiently as possible. So in circumstances like this, if I have a situation where I would really get in trouble if I spread metal all across, and I have an ammunition that I can most likely render safely without big complication, then the decision would be to render it safe there and then, carry both components, the detonator if it's possible, because it's not possible for every type of mine, and the main charge, and then store them temporarily, and then dispose all of the items that I've gathered and render safe at the end of the day, every day. So the ultimate goal of this is the destruction of these of this ammunition, because the rendering safe, I mean, you can put it back together sometimes, and then it's not very useful to just disarm them. If we're going to keep them, we still have the hazard in a different location, maybe in a slightly different configuration, but the hazard is there, and the ultimate goal is always to remove and to destroy this hazard permanently.
Thank you very much, Edson. Can I now give the floor to Colin King?
I think we've all agreed that there are times when having a disarmed, free from explosive real mine is a real advantage for various types of research, for realistic looks and so on. And the answer to the question I think was asked about how difficult and dangerous this is, I think was answered by Greg, that the reality is, in many cases, it is not difficult and it is not dangerous. But that is if you have an umbrella of systems and risk assessments in place. So you need to understand intimately the type of mine. You need to have gone through risk assessment, and then even the facilities can be very basic. Where I am here, actually, in the Falklands, we set this up sometimes in tents, sometimes in a container, with very few facilities. So it then depends on the type of mine. So something like the VS50 here, once it's disarmed, taking it to pieces and taking out the explosive couldn't be simpler, as long as you know that. Whereas the POM-2, POM-3, the Russian mine here, that is incredibly difficult and dangerous to take apart. It took us days of risk assessment and planning. So you need to know, and you need to have those systems, and this is ISO type safety systems of very careful risk assessment, the application of controls, documentation, and so forth. There are big advantages, and what we do is take these apart mainly to assess them, exactly as we've been hearing, that because the circumstances can be different for different mines and produce different effects, whenever we go into a program, whether it's a cluster munition, a missile, or a landmine, the first thing we do is take it completely to pieces to make that assessment of how different components and energetic materials have changed. Once you've done that, you can reassemble it to make a very useful training aid. And that training aid will then also be realistic. So, for example, that mine, the Chinese Type 72, when it's new, it is just about borderline detectable. When it's aged and the mild steel components have rusted, it can dip below that detectability threshold. So that's a very useful thing to have. A real one where the metal content is lower and it's degraded. So yeah, it's not a difficult thing to do as long as you know what you're doing and have that process surrounding you.
Thank you very much, Colin. So before we go to the next and final session, I'll give the floor to Côte d'Ivoire for it's the last question on this session. So Côte d'Ivoire, s'il vous plaît.
Okay, merci Président. En fait, ce n'est pas une question, c'est juste une contribution. Je pense que les trois présentateurs ont déjà donné tous les éléments, mais c'est juste apporter un élément de réponse pour dire que la gestion des mines se fait de différentes manières. Surtout quand les mines sont stockées, on a plus d'aisance à la manipuler que lorsqu'elles sont déjà posées. Parce que généralement, quand elles sont posées, tout dépend de l'endroit où on se trouve. Il y a certains endroits où une mine peut en cacher une autre. Voilà, donc c'était pour faire sortir cet élément-là. Mais pour les questions de manipulation et de gestion des mines, c'est mieux de laisser la place aux experts. Je pense qu'avec les experts, ils ont déjà toutes les procédures, comment faire pour pouvoir désamorcer, pour qu'on puisse véritablement avoir un résultat assez efficient. Je vous remercie.